Hello everyone and welcome back. In this video I'll be demonstrating how I go about painting red cloaks and cloth. To start off with here, I'm going to be using a large size 3 brush, and then I'll be applying several thin layers of a Mephiston red for the base coat. Mephiston is a really nice saturated red that has great coverage, although you'll notice this base coat is very patchy to begin with, and this is absolutely fine for the first coat. I'm just looking for nice quick and thin layers that the following coats will grip to, and around 3 to 4 coats should be sufficient for a nice smooth and opaque base coat. During these coats I make sure to inspect and remove any bits of dust and impurities in the paint before it dries, as these can cause problems later on. For the first soft shade on the cloak, I'm going to be using Corn Red, and this is thin to a glaze consistency. I also added a touch of Daler Rowney Matte Glaze Medium to this, although you could also use Citadel Lamium Medium. And this is to help get a smoother, more consistent coverage, although it's not completely necessary. Now, because this paint is quite thinned, we have a little bit of time before it starts to dry, so we can push the pigment around on the surface and really guide it to where we want it, in this case into the recesses. Remember not to overload your brush when glazing. We're looking for a brush tip that's just damp and not soaking with paint. This is going to make it much more controllable when we're trying to get those thin layers across the surface and also prevent too much pooling paint. It pays to be a little patient here and be prepared that it might take a few layers to build up these transitions. Each glaze layer will also take a few moments to dry thoroughly before another coat can be applied. Waiting for it to dry properly will help stop any unsightly tearing in the paint. Continuing with the shading, I added a touch of black into the Corn Red, just a tiny bit is needed to begin with, as the black can quite easily overpower the shading. So here you can see the method of applying the glaze into the recess before quickly washing off the brush, then removing the excess water either on a paper towel or into your mouth before applying the brush back to the surface and then blending out the transition. This has to be done very quickly because acrylic paint is constantly drying. I like to have my clean pot of water close to me so I can quickly wash off the brush. And I don't always use this method, but it is very useful on larger blended areas like this, and you'll see me doing this a lot later on when it comes to blending up the brighter reds. Once I was done with the darker shading, I quickly went back in with some of the Corn Red and glazed some of this in between just to smooth out the transitions a bit further. Now I'm going for quite a bright and saturated red cloak here, so I'm going to make a 1-to-1 mix of Evil Sun Scarlet and Mephiston Red, and then start to layer this over the folds of the cloak. Again, this is going to take a few coats to build up a nice opaque layer. Here I'm using a thinner layer and pushing the pigment where I want it, starting off in the darker part of the transition and then lifting off with the brush where I want the majority of the pigment to be left. It's important to remember this, that where you leave off with the brush is where the majority of the pigment will be left. So when glazing up like this, always start from dark to light. Remembering this technique will really help you to achieve the smoothest transitions. Now, I started to apply the first soft highlights using Evil Sun Scarlet. And when I say soft, I mean that I try to create a more blended or softer transition for this first stage. And it's important to reiterate that I'm painting a piece of flowing cloth here and not a piece of armor. So the curves and the shapes of the cloth aren't sharp but soft. And I feel the need to treat these accordingly. Even though later on we can still apply some sharper highlights to get that heavy metal style, it's important to ease into them with the first softer stages. One of the things that people tend to struggle with when working with red is the difference in finish across a blended area. Some areas can be more matte or more satin depending on the paint being used, and this can lead to the transitions looking messy and not as smooth. So to help smooth out the transitions on the red, I made a mix of some contrast paints. This is a roughly 1-to-1 mix of Bile Red and Flesh Tearers Red. And into this I added a touch of AK Ultra Matte and a touch of De La Rowney Glaze Medium, and then further thinned it down with water. The plan is to glaze this very thinly across the entire surface, and this will help to blend all of the red together and unify the finish of the cloak. The glaze medium is slightly on the shiny or satin side, and the AK Ultra Matte is extremely matte as the name suggests. It can very easily completely dull the finish if overused, but using both of these in combination allows me to dial in the perfect finish that I'm looking for. Incidentally, you can use both of these products just with pure water to matte down transfers or even a wash that's gone too glossy. It's an amazing combination and one that I've started to use a lot to play around with different finishes. Once that was dry, I went back in with a regular chunky edge highlight of Evil Sun Scarlet, and this was around all of the sharper edges of the cloth. For the next highlight, I used Wild Rider Red, again using this on the sharpest folds of the cloth and edges. For the next sharper highlight, I used AK Deep Orange. This is basically Citadel Trollslayer Orange, but it has much better coverage and it is easier to work with, especially for highlights. For the next highlight, I used Fire Dragon Bright, focusing this on the upwards facing folds and the sharper edges of the cloth. And then for the final highlights, I added some Ushabti bone into the Fire Dragon Bright and then used this on the sharpest corners and edges where the light is going to be catching. You could also opt to use something like Towlite Ochre or Ungor Flesh for this. And this is completely optional, but I did add a couple of dot highlights just by mixing some white into the Ushabti bone. And then that was it, the cloak was finally finished. So let me know if this video has been useful, guys. Maybe there's a couple of tips here that you didn't already know about. I'll be doing lots more regular short videos like this, explaining different topics. So if you have any ideas on things that you'd like to see, then drop them in the comments below, and I'll catch you in the next video.